All we've learned about the history of humanity is on the verge of crumbling beneath a truth that was never supposed to endure through deserts, under oceans, or within mountains. Evidence we cannot explain continues to emerge. Evidence suggesting 6 civilizations vanished long before our own. And with each fresh finding, the crack in our understanding of time grows wider, unveiling a design far more ancient, far more threatening than anything our education ever revealed. If you sense the narrative changing underneath you, subscribe and journey with us into the reality concealed beneath 7 worlds that time forgot. History doesn't fall apart gradually. It fractures, not from one single discovery, but from countless tiny breaks, spreading across time like fissures through old glass. A single structure that has no right to exist might be written off as a fluke. A lone relic predating humanity might be explained away as some kind of contamination. But once these flukes start showing up in every direction, in arid wastelands, on mountain tops, on the floors of oceans, ignoring the design becomes impossible. Reality itself seems to be tearing open the narrative we were given, laying bare fragments of something much older, much more sophisticated, and much more intentional. Even the scholars who previously ridiculed these ideas now choose their words carefully because the proof no longer murmurs. It roars. And each roar originates from a different region of the globe, all repeating the same truth that shouldn't be possible. Ours was never the first civilization. But what disturbs us most isn't the objects themselves or the ancient sites. It's how precise everything is. These findings don't challenge history in some random fashion. They challenge it with purpose, almost like surgical strikes, as though someone wiped away entire eras while leaving behind only enough pieces to torment whoever dug them up. The further down you venture, the more these fractures synchronize with one another. Designs start to match. Chronologies begin to overlap. Societies we assumed had zero contact suddenly reveal similarities that shouldn't exist. It feels as though 6 forgotten civilizations once thrived, perished, and left behind merely a trace of their existence. And every bit of it leads toward one question that terrifies us, a question we were never supposed to pose. What force destroyed them? The object discovered was compact enough to rest in someone's palm, yet significant enough to shake the very foundation of every timeline we accept. Far inside a limestone shaft that had caved in, explorers uncovered a metal cube with edges so flawless, so mathematically exact, that even contemporary engineers found replicating them difficult. The stone surrounding it dated back millions of years, sealed, undisturbed, a perfect tomb. And yet there the cube sat, waiting. It showed no corrosion. It bore no fractures. It appeared as though it had been positioned there only yesterday. When the analysis crews showed up, they anticipated contamination. But the geological setting was perfect. No marks from tools anywhere near it, no interruptions in the layers, no indication that any human had ever descended to that level. That cube didn't merely question history, it destroyed it. The genuine shock arrived hours afterward when a second object surfaced in a coal deposit on the opposite side of the planet. Another shape of metal with impossible precision. Then a third discovery, this one trapped inside volcanic residue older than our entire species. 3 relics, 3 separate continents, 3 geological periods that should never come together. And right as the information started circulating, right as scientists got ready to reveal a finding that would transform humanity's grasp of where we came from, the documentation disappeared. Files deleted, photographs damaged, permissions cancelled. The findings didn't simply go missing, they were deliberately removed. And that brings up an even darker thought. Who moved quickly enough to erase them? Every society across Earth preserves a tale about a civilization that existed before theirs. A civilization annihilated by flames, by rising water, by endless darkness, or by freezing ice. For many generations, these accounts were rejected as legend, as symbolic cautions, as poetic overstatements. as creative metaphors. But when structures with matching geometry surface on land masses, divided by whole oceans, when celestial alignments show up again in cultures that supposedly never encountered each other, when tongues that should share no common roots echo identical lost symbols, the legend starts appearing less like metaphor and more like recollection. A recollection not of one vanished civilization, but of six. Six societies that climbed high enough to reshape the planet and fell so utterly that only pieces endured. The most peculiar aspect? Their falls were not accidental. They were synchronized throughout seismic records, ice samples, and ocean deposits. Identical catastrophic markers repeat at nearly matching time intervals. Deluges that reshaped entire continents, volcanic seasons that obscured the sun, instantaneous freezes that locked whole territories in ice. And within every collapse layer, a quiet mystery persists. Why were these civilizations erased with such completeness? No makeshift remnants, no gradual decline, only sudden conclusions followed by extended periods of silence. It resembles less a natural calamity and more a deliberate reset. A reset so exact, it hints at purpose. And if six civilizations were reset before ours, then we have to wonder, what power possessed enough strength to accomplish it? The further we examine Earth's geological record, the more a single disturbing design starts to show itself. Ice samples from opposite hemispheres document identical sudden climate disruptions. Instances where temperatures dropped or spiked within a single decade. Ocean floor deposits reveal strata of ash and microscopic glass from collisions so fierce they left chemical traces in the air itself. Tree growth rings, frozen floodplains, deserted coastlines, all resonate with the same cadence. A cadence of destruction repeating across tens of thousands of years. It's as though the planet inhales in patterns, extended periods of stillness followed by sudden and catastrophic releases. And the most troubling aspect isn't that these occurrences took place, but that the spacing between them remains almost entirely uniform, like the rhythmic ticking of some cosmic timepiece we never knew we inhabited. Now, contemporary instruments pick up identical signals appearing once more. The magnetic field grows weaker. The poles shift more rapidly than any recorded point in history. Deep ocean flows decelerate and stutter as though getting ready to reverse. Dormant volcanoes for ages begin rumbling back into activity. Even the stars overhead transform, minor changes, but sufficient for astronomers to quietly mention that something feels wrong. These aren't scattered random events, they're repetitions. Repetitions of the same warning signs that surfaced before each downfall of the societies that preceded us. And if the design is surfacing again now, then the cycle might already be underway. The only remaining question is, how near are we to the next rotation? If six societies rose and collapsed before ours, then everything we label as ancient represents merely the opening page of the concluding chapter. The structures we marvel at might not be starting points. They might be the final reverberations of those who survived past catastrophes. Their stories of firestorms, perpetual night, and submerged continents weren't symbolic language. They were witness accounts, cautions etched into stone because paper, timber, and memory couldn't outlast whatever ended their civilization. Throughout every society, every period, every separated people, the identical narrative emerges in pieces. A civilization that prospered, a civilization that vanished, and a selected remnant instructed to protect knowledge for the following awakening. Until this moment, these similarities seemed symbolic, but when examined alongside geological proof, celestial patterns, and the abrupt emergence of technology that shouldn't exist, they lock together with horrifying precision. The past isn't a straight path. It's a coil, and coils inevitably circle back to where they started. So the question transforms. It's no longer, did these societies exist? The proof is undeniable. The actual question, the one we were never meant to contemplate, is far more threatening. Did something destroy them intentionally? Because the design of their collapse appears less like the work of nature and more like deliberate action, as if each civilization was wiped away the instant it crossed a particular boundary. And now, with our own world nearing that identical boundary, one understanding becomes unavoidable. Whatever destroyed the 6 civilizations before us might already be observing the 7th. The first forbidden relic wasn't unearthed in some distant cavern or submerged structure. It was located by chance during standard quarry operations. Laborers penetrated a dense limestone stratum, anticipating nothing beyond old sediment, only to expose a flawlessly smooth metal object lodged far inside the rock. Its exterior caught light like buffed chrome despite remaining sealed for millions of years. When Earth scientists inspected the adjacent strata, they understood the layers had never been breached. No passage, no break-in, no evidence of digging. The metal wasn't pushed into the stone. The stone had developed surrounding it. That straightforward finding, that single impossibility, ripped open a gateway into a history where something intelligent existed long before humanity ever emerged, and the further they excavated, the more impossible objects surfaced. Before long, other locations started reporting comparable relics. Metal orbs with perfect symmetry, rods more precise than surgical instruments, crystalline networks that glowed faintly when warmed. Scientists murmured about machining impressions too flawless for human craftsmanship, metal combinations that have no business existing, and shapes no ancient society could have imagined. These weren't implements of early humanity. They were remnants of something more ancient, something capable of construction on a magnitude we still find challenging to comprehend. And yet, each relic shared one unsettling commonality. They were all enclosed inside pristine geological strata, as if concealed on purpose, locked away from whatever future society might emerge. Which brings us to the question nobody wishes to voice openly. Who, or what, concealed them? The following relic was even more difficult to rationalize away. Far within a coal layer created from vegetation older than any human predecessor, excavators discovered an iron mallet, but not an ordinary mallet. Its head was crafted from metal so pure, so immune to decay, that metallurgists confessed they had no rational explanation. The timber handle, transformed into stone, traced back hundreds of millions of years. To acknowledge the relic as authentic meant acknowledging something unimaginable. A sophisticated implement existed long before the first acknowledged humans ever mastered stone carving. Scientists tried to rationalize it as contamination, a fabrication, anything possible, but the geological setting was airtight. The coal had developed naturally, encompassing the mallet. It had rested there from the start. Then appeared the brass chime discovered inside solid stone, the device resembling a spark plug concealed in volcanic debris, and the machined metal cube extracted from layers older than mammals. Each fresh finding pushed the limits of human chronology further backward until the timeline broke apart. These weren't random items. They were implements, crafted implements, abandoned by a society erased from history. Yet, even as scientists rushed to examine them, a troubling design surfaced. Documentation disappeared. Relics were discreetly transferred. Images were obscured, mislabeled, substituted. It seemed as though an unseen force moved more swiftly than the researchers themselves, eliminating every trace before the public could pose the one question that would transform everything. If these implements belong to someone, then where is the civilization that made them? If the relics suggested an ancient society, the submerged structures eliminated all uncertainty. Along the shores of Japan, India, Cuba, and the Mediterranean, sonar readings exposed enormous geometric constructions, staircases, platforms, pathways, barriers, all resting hundreds of feet under the surface. These arrangements were too exact to be natural formations, yet too ancient to fit any recognized culture. Divers described standing on what resembled drowned boulevards, laid with stones carved so precisely they could compete with contemporary construction. Complete city layouts surfaced beneath the ocean bottom, corresponding to the accounts of ancient flood legends transmitted across innumerable generations. It was as though these settlements were suspended in time, maintained at the precise instant they were engulfed by climbing waters. But the genuine enigma resided in the worldwide coordination. These flooded settlements didn't vanish one after another. They disappeared nearly at the same time, struck by a devastating occurrence massive enough to submerge entire shorelines around the planet. And then there were the markings, matching engravings located thousands of miles separated, corresponding to celestial designs far more ancient than humanity's earliest timekeeping systems. Some constructions aligned with stellar locations not visible in over 20,000 years. Others indicated toward magnetic directions that no longer remain. The inference was inescapable. These settlements belonged to a civilization that grasped the Earth far more profoundly than we do, and if they were eliminated in one worldwide catastrophe, then the following question was even more disturbing. What force could extend across the complete planet simultaneously? Initially, the vanishings appeared like basic negligence. A wrongly labeled container in one place, a damaged file in another. But as more relics surfaced, implements in rock, metal, in coal, structures beneath the ocean, something far more peculiar started occurring. University reports were retracted within hours of being published. Complete research groups discovered their excavation authorizations cancelled without justification. Museum workers whispered about items discreetly taken from archive rooms during the night, substituted with vacant shelves and documents stamped restricted. In multiple instances, digital collections were erased so comprehensively that even recovery specialists couldn't restore the source information. It was as though the relics were being eliminated from reality before the world got the opportunity to witness them, and not through chance, but through planning. The design grew more obvious when scientists exchanged observations across nations. The vanishings happened in separate nations, under separate administrations, separate regulations. Yet the result was invariably the same. The proof evaporated. Even more troubling were the reports of unmarked transportation arriving minutes following discoveries, as though someone already understood where and when the relics would surface. Excavators mentioned unfamiliar individuals in black clothing securing excavation locations long before officials were alerted. Divers discussed naval craft discreetly monitoring their missions. Satellite photographs of submerged structures were substituted with artificial cloud obstruction within days. Whoever eliminated the relics wasn't operating slowly or hesitantly. They were operating with exactness, almost as though they had executed this design previously, almost as though they were anticipating us to locate these hints once more. Every relic we discovered, every metal sphere, every machined implement, every submerged foundation indicated toward a single repeating design, not a design of construction, but of consciousness. These remnants weren't accidental remains of a lost civilization. They constituted a system, a framework of understanding dispersed across landmasses long before our iteration of humanity surfaced. But as scientists charted these markings, these designs, these recurring mathematical traces, something unexpected occurred. They started surfacing in locations they had no business being. Not on rocks, not on structures, but in surprising biological documentation. Genetic arrangements displayed geometric configurations matching the engravings on flooded temples. Brain structures reflected the identical proportions carved into massive stone barriers. It was as though the designers of the ancient civilization had abandoned more than structures. They abandoned an impression on something that could outlast any disaster. That understanding transformed everything. If the relics were eliminated, concealed, hidden, annihilated, then the sole location remaining to maintain the truth was inside the survivors themselves. Not in narratives, not in structures, but in the physical form, transmitted quietly across time, anticipating the civilization to arrive at an instant when the design returned. A caution encoded not in rock, but in heredity. And the further geneticists examined, the more evident the communication became. The account of the vanished societies was never intended to be located in the earth. It was intended to be located in us, which imposes a far more unsettling question. If our genetic code preserves recollections of the civilization before ours, then what else is it readying us for? For many years, geneticists assumed human diversity fit comfortably into the divisions of our evolutionary progression, until they located a design that didn't fit anywhere within it. Concealed far within less than 0.5% of the population exists a collection of genes that operates unlike anything else in the human genetic library. It doesn't correspond with environment. It doesn't associate with movement. It doesn't surface in any recognized ancestral path. Instead, it surfaces distributed in mountaintop settlements in India, in secluded coastal populations of Southeast Asia, in the most distant territories of Australia, and among the Basque inhabitants of Western Europe. These populations share no mutual tongue, no common cultural beginning, no documented link, and yet they possess the identical genetic marker, a marker so ancient it comes before human dispersal itself, a marker that has no right to exist unless it originated from a population vanished long before documented time. The further scientists investigated, the more peculiar the design became. This collection doesn't operate like a standard mutation. It operates like a transmission, something transferred purposefully across ages through survivors of a civilization erased. Some geneticists murmured that it isn't an aberration, but a trace of a society that endured through a cataclysm and transported pieces of its understanding forward in the sole container that could survive flames, ice, heredity, and darkness. The human form, yet the genuine enigma isn't its existence, but its function, because when the collection activates under particular environmental circumstances, something unmistakable occurs. Capabilities start to manifest that have no business existing in contemporary humans, which imposes a question researchers have evaded for years. If this collection didn't originate from us, then who was it designed for? The genetic collection didn't merely possess unusual arrangements. It possessed capabilities precisely designed for endurance in a collapsing civilization. People who possess these characteristics demonstrate improved resistance to oxygen deprivation, permitting them to operate in reduced oxygen situations where others would fail. Their muscle tissue recovers more rapidly under extreme pressure. Their internal rhythms stay constant during extended darkness. Even more remarkable, brain imaging exposes intensified stimulation in spatial orientation territories, the precise neural channels necessary for traversing unknown landscapes, monitoring celestial motion, and detecting environmental transformations. These aren't accidental capabilities. They are endurance instruments. Instruments for surviving deluges, ash storms, volcanic seasons, and worldwide migrations across devastated territories. Instruments for surviving precisely the categories of disasters that destroyed the previous societies. But the most disturbing aspect is how these characteristics surface together, not distributed, not sporadic, assembled, as though component of a single transmission transferred from a single origin, and they operate as though anticipating, inactive, until activated by particular external circumstances. Climbing carbon dioxide concentrations, magnetic field displacement, abrupt climate variations, pressures matching those that came before ancient collapses. As these circumstances escalate in the current period, the collection is starting to activate once more. Not figuratively, not symbolically, actually. Brain channels illuminate, metabolic transformations increase, reactions sharpen. It's as though something far within the human genetic code has started to awaken, something that recalls a civilization we never individually experienced, yet somehow still possess within us. Which brings us to a question nobody can respond to. Are these characteristics returning because the pattern is returning? Some recollections are inscribed in narratives, some in rock, but a select few are inscribed in the form itself. As scientists monitored the genetic collection across landmasses, they uncovered something remarkable. People possessing this heritage share reflexive reactions to environmental signals they've never witnessed. They identify transformations in climate designs before devices detect them. They can traverse unknown territories with remarkable precision, directed by an internal orientation even they cannot rationalize. Some describe a sensation of recognition around ancient structures, as though something concealed inside their biology stirs in the existence of particular markings, particular stones, particular stellar configurations. These aren't acquired patterns. They are transmitted reactions, reverberations from predecessors who endured worldwide conclusions that contemporary history declines to recognize. What astonished researchers even more were the recollection assessments. Possessors demonstrated intensified design identification when presented to photographs of flooded settlements, massive rock constructions, or celestial diagrams from prehistoric periods. Their minds reacted more rapidly, more intensely, with brain traces resembling recognition rather than unfamiliarity. It was as though their forms identified something their consciousness had never witnessed. The inference was unavoidable, unsettling, and undeniable. This genetic heritage doesn't merely maintain biology, it maintains recollection. A recollection of territories that no longer remain, atmospheres that no longer correspond, societies erased so utterly that only their concluding survivors transported the truth forward in their genetic code. And if such a recollection endured extinction, then what else might it be readying to disclose? If the genetic collection was simply a biological oddity, the account might have concluded there. But the territorial dispersal of these characteristics exposes something far more significant and far more disturbing. The possessors of this ancient heritage reside in territories that correspond exactly with the most ancient worldwide flood legends, collision strata, volcanic season traces, and the movement paths of prehistoric survivors. The elevated regions of India, the isolated shores of Australia, the protected river valleys of Southeast Asia, the mountain recesses of the Basque territory. Every one of these populations resides in a position that would have constituted a natural sanctuary during a worldwide cataclysm. These were the elevated peaks, the cavern networks, the shielded plateaus where the traces of a collapsing civilization could persist. And as the civilization stabilized, those survivors transported pieces of understanding, pieces they couldn't completely comprehend, into the following period. But what they transported was more than accounts. It was reflex. It was recollection. It was the final genetic reverberation of a society that collapsed so utterly that even its designation did not endure. Throughout these populations, ancient markings surface in tradition with remarkable similarity. Stellar configurations are recalled not as legend, but as directional implements, and environmental transformations are interpreted with an awareness contemporary science cannot rationalize. These aren't random occurrences. They are traces of persistence, a heritage that survived the unimaginable and reconstructed humanity from the remnants of a civilization now vanished. And if those predecessors endured one collapse, then their successors might detect something returning long before our devices identify it, which raises the question, Why is the most ancient recollection in our genetic code starting to stir? Now, as researchers traced the beginnings of the genetic collection, one disclosure became unavoidable to disregard. This transmission did not start with humanity. Its configuration, its stimulation designs, its remarkable coordination with celestial patterns, all of it indicated toward a heritage that came before our species completely. It was as though the survivors of a lost civilization inscribed their final caution directly into the forms of the individuals who would arrive following them. Not an account engraved in rock, not a prediction inscribed in legend, but a communication transported in physical form. A communication constructed to outlast flames, deluge, freezing, and time. Contemporary humans didn't generate this recollection, we obtained it. And that signifies the constructors of the ancient civilization didn't merely abandon structures, they abandoned successors. Throughout laboratories, throughout landmasses, throughout fields of study, scientists arrived at the identical disturbing inference. The human genetic code possesses relics, not metal, not rock, but data, encoded markings, repeating proportions, celestial designs concealed in proteins, in brain construction, in the architecture of our consciousness. We weren't the initial society, we were the initial to lose memory. And now, as environmental circumstances replicate those of the previous worldwide collapse, the ancient recollection is stirring once more, as though readying us for something the initial constructors understood would return, something inscribed not in chronology, but in biology. If you're still present, remain with us. Approve this presentation so more individuals can pursue the path we were never intended to witness. Because the following section poses a question even more disturbing. If our genetic code recalls the history, then what did the structures recall? If our genetic code possesses recollections of a civilization erased, then the structures that civilization constructed must still reverberate somewhere throughout the planet. And they do, not on the exterior, where younger societies added their own strata, but underneath them, excavations under Egypt, under Peru, under China, under Turkey, expose the identical concealed truth. The most ancient construction is the most sophisticated. Profound foundations, engraved with precision resembling laser work. Internal spaces coordinated to celestial indicators. Connections so compressed that even atmosphere cannot travel through. These are not the productions of early societies experimenting with rock. These are the traces of constructors who received understanding so thorough it required no progression. The further archaeologists excavate, the more advanced the construction becomes. A technological inversion so complete that no historical framework can rationalize it. But something even more peculiar occurs when these concealed strata are evaluated. Their measurements correspond to the geometry encoded in the enigmatic genetic collection. Their arrangements reflect the celestial chronologies that endure in human awareness. Their dimensions reverberate the identical proportions that surface in the brain imaging of those whose heritage endured the previous collapse. These constructions are not separated structures. They are construction recollection, physical manifestations of the identical understanding maintained biologically within us, as though the final society encoded its communication twice, once in rock and once in heredity. And that introduces a question that intensifies with every revealed space. If the foundations come before all recognized societies, then who or what constructed the foundation they rest upon? Once the profound strata were examined, a second design surfaced, one even more difficult to reject. Constructions divided by waters, by land masses, by thousands of years, all possess matching construction traces. Multi-sided stonework with interlocking geometry, angular pressure relief incisions absorbing seismic force, direction toward identical ancient stellar locations, platforms measured to identical solar trajectory computations. These characteristics are located in the Andes, the Mediterranean, Asia, the Pacific, in all directions. Societies that never communicated, never exchanged, never possessed common tongue or implements, somehow constructed with identical construction reasoning. No chronologist can rationalize it, but survivors of a preceding society, directed by transmitted recollections, could. The design didn't distribute throughout the planet. It resurfaced throughout the planet, activated by individuals who recalled pieces of an older construction. The further the evaluations proceed, the more unimaginable the similarities become. Microscopic groove impressions on rocks in Japan correspond to those located in Peru. Bore openings in Turkey reflect those underneath Saqqara. Identical proportions encoded in submerged structures surface in celestial engravings under the Sahara. It's as though Earth once possessed a single worldwide construction tongue, a unified consciousness that molded the planet long before the emergence of Egypt, Sumer, or the Indus River Valley. Not a society of wandering populations, but a civilization with magnitude, organization, and intention. And if their construction philosophy endures in distributed structures throughout the planet, then it raises a far more profound question. What category of civilization requires construction that persists through cataclysm? If the genetic collection maintained recollection in physical form, the structures maintained recollection in rock. But unlike the genetic code, which stirs quietly, the structures communicate loudly and unmistakably. They indicate skyward. They indicate to patterns. They indicate to celestial designs that repeat not across hundreds of years, but across tens of thousands of years. And here is the unimaginable aspect. Numerous structures correspond not with the contemporary atmosphere, but with an atmosphere that remained long before documented chronology. Some correspond with Orion as it surfaced 12,000 years previously. Others indicate towards celestial locations vanished to rotational displacement. Some even monitor the progression of Earth's oscillation, a pattern only completely grasped by contemporary science in the previous 150 years. Whoever constructed the foundations of the civilization grasped astronomy beyond anything their supposed societies should have possessed. They were monitoring something, anticipating something, anticipating something. Astronomers examining these correspondences made a disturbing finding. The structures don't merely chart the atmosphere. They encode the chronology of previous disasters. Solar patterns coincide with deluge strata. Magnetic transformations coincide with volcanic seasons. Stellar designs coincide with extinction surges. And as the atmosphere transforms currently, the correspondences start corresponding once more, as though the ancient civilization anticipated the pattern to return. These structures aren't merely chronological locations. They are cautions, celestial timekeepers, anchors of recollection constructed to endure flames, freezing, and deluge. And if their constructors connected them to the identical cosmic pattern encoded in our genetic code, then the question becomes unavoidable. What occurrence were they readying the future for? The more construction specialists examine these ancient foundations, the more unimaginable they become. In Japan, in Peru, in Egypt, in Turkey, in all directions, the design repeats. Rocks measuring dozens or even hundreds of mass units elevated and positioned with such exactness that even a contemporary lifting device could not duplicate it without fracturing. Some sections interlock with internal connections so intricate they resemble three-dimensional arrangements engraved with millimetric precision. Others possess resonant spaces adjusted to particular vibrations, oscillating quietly when contacted, as though constructed for sound construction far beyond anything ancient societies were recognized to grasp. But the most peculiar findings reside within the incisions themselves. Under microscopic magnification, numerous exteriors possess groove impressions corresponding to rapid rotary implements, matching across land masses and time intervals that according to established chronology had zero contact whatsoever. These were not basic constructors. These were construction specialists operating from understanding. And perhaps most troubling is the perception of intention behind these constructions. They are not accidental structures. They are not ornamental temples or ritual barriers. Their forms absorb seismic force. Their foundations correspond with energy-abundant geological concentrated areas. Their spaces amplify sound in methods only contemporary physics can rationalize. Some surface constructed to accumulate energy, others to channel it, and some to resist cataclysmic forces that would annihilate standard constructions. It's as though the designers anticipated a civilization-ending occurrence and constructed their constructions to endure it, or perhaps to caution the survivors who arrived following, which abandons one concluding question suspended over every excavation location. If these structures were constructed for a particular intention, then what precisely were they constructed to resist? As scientists evaluated thousands of measurements, correspondences, and construction similarities, a disclosure gradually surfaced, one too enormous to be chance. The structures throughout Earth didn't merely resemble one another, they linked. When charted on a worldwide chart, their direction paths, celestial routes, and geometric relationships constituted a lattice, a planetary framework, as though the ancient civilization had been charted according to a single unifying network. This framework corresponded with magnetic concentrations, fault boundaries, solar patterns, and energy-concentrated areas in methods contemporary Earth scientists are only starting to grasp. It was a design not of separate settlements, but of a complete planetary system. The constructors were not considering in categories of nations or territories. They were considering in categories of Earth itself. And this was not the pattern of populations emerging from primitive periods. This was the pattern of a society that grasped worldwide networks because they had endured worldwide collapse. Even more disturbing is what resides between the concentrations of this framework. In the profound water, in arid regions, underneath frozen layers, underneath forests, imaging technology exposes construction following construction, concealed, flooded, or devastated by ancient cataclysm. Settlements, organized in coils, elevated structures, corresponded to disappeared equinoxes, ports, constructed for shorelines that no longer remain. When these structures are added to the framework, a nearly thorough chart of a lost society surfaces, one that extended across landmasses before the waters climbed, before arid regions developed, before frozen regions withdrew. It's the absent representation of a civilization far more ancient and far more sophisticated than ours. And the understanding becomes unavoidable. These structures are not the start of human society. They are the final enduring pieces of the society that existed before the deluge, which brings us unmistakably to the following disclosure. If their settlements are concealed underneath waters and arid regions, then what accounts did those flooded civilizations abandon? Long before the land masses assumed their contemporary formation, long before the waters climbed to engulf the shorelines, Sunderland extended throughout what is currently Indonesia, Malaysia, and portions of Southeast Asia. An enormous, abundant civilization that remained during the previous glacial period. Ancient waterway networks, still observable on the water bottom, expose a territory perfect for early society. Broad plains, plentiful water, endless shoreline, and constant environment. Sonar charting reveals previous valleys engraved with unnaturally linear paths, platforms molded into geometric designs, and passages that resemble constructed waterways rather than natural arrangements. If any early society possessed the capacity to prosper, to organize, to construct, it was Sunderland. A civilization erased when climbing waters consumed its settlements in a single devastating surge of meltwater, and yet its recollection reverberates in legends throughout Asia. Accounts of territories vanished instantaneously underneath a roaring, approaching barrier of water. Even more persuasive are the markings located in cavern sanctuaries throughout the territory. Stellar charts carved in rock correspond to formations as they surfaced more than 12,000 years previously. Coils, frameworks, and interlocking geometries reflect the designs located in massive rock structures, thousands of miles separated. These impressions do not fit isolated populations. They fit a unified society with sophisticated understanding of astronomy, geometry, and shoreline construction. And when scientists evaluate these designs with the worldwide structure framework exposed in the preceding section, everything corresponds. Sunderland wasn't merely a vanished landmass. It was one of the central concentrations of the ancient civilization, a concentration engulfed so utterly that only the water bottom recalls it, which abandons one disturbing question climbing with the current. What did Sunderland possess that was valuable enough to erase so utterly? Currently, the Sahara is an expanse of temperature and quiet, but for thousands of years, it was an abundant civilization of waters, waterways, forests, and prospering biological systems. Satellite photography exposes ancient shorelines extending hundreds of miles, and underneath the particles reside constructions far too geometric to be natural. Concealed rectangles, circular foundations, extended passages engulfed by particles. Stone illustration depicts vessels cutting through profound water, settlements vibrating with existence, and assemblies that resemble organized society rather than distributed wandering populations. The Sahara was not an arid region during the period of the ancient constructors. It was a foundation of society, a civilization capable of massive construction, maritime exchange, and cross-continental impact. But when the precipitation ceased and the environment transformed suddenly, the territory collapsed, abandoning its structures entombed underneath mountains of drifting particles. More troubling is how these concealed constructions correspond with the worldwide framework revealed in previous sections. Their locations correspond to energy concentrations possessed by structures on distant landmasses. Their geometry reflects identical golden proportions encoded in the genetic collection. Their celestial directions indicate toward patterns matching those witnessed in submerged structures. It's almost as though the Sahara Society was once linked to a worldwide system, a system intended to be erased when the civilization transformed. And as scientists persist to image underneath the particles, more and more aberrations surface, suggesting the Sahara possesses mysteries far more ancient than Egypt, more ancient than Sumer, more ancient than documented time itself. But the question persists: how sophisticated was this territory before the arid region consumed it? Between Siberia and Alaska, once extended an enormous temperate grassland recognized as Bangia, a civilization of waterways, massive fauna, and prospering human populations. Far from constituting a barren frozen bridge, Bangia was a territory. Constant temperatures, plentiful sustenance, and geological characteristics perfect for occupation. Recent satellite photography exposes patterns underneath the frozen soil that resemble ancient field separations, circular assembly constructions, and extended linear pathways engraved into the terrain. In dissolving frozen layers, seekers have revealed implements far more sophisticated than anticipated for the territory, including composite cutting tools and engraved indicators corresponded to northern stellar routes. These findings suggest Bangia wasn't simply a movement route. It was a society adapted to freezing, darkness, and extreme circumstances. What makes Bangia even more enigmatic is how its indicators correspond with identical celestial designs located in Sunderland and the Sahara. Its rock circles reflect those in Britain. Its celestial indicators correspond to those in the Andes. Its correspondences monitor cosmic patterns matching the ones encoded in the structures underneath Egypt. It surfaces that even in the most frigid boundaries of the ancient civilization, the identical parent society abandoned its impression. A unified understanding network, extending across environments and landmasses. When water levels climbed at the conclusion of the frozen period, Pangaea disappeared underwater, and with it, a complete section of humanity's lost account. But relics persist to surface from dissolving frozen layers, imposing researchers to reconsider history. And the persistent question persists. What category of society prospered in a civilization where cold season persisted half the year? Long before the emergence of Greece, long before Egypt engraved its initial dynasty into rock, the Mediterranean basin was territory to a seafaring population whose impact extended from the islands of Malta to Cyprus, to Crete, and far into the shorelines now divided by time. What endures of them is divided. Massive rock temples corresponded with the solstices, port constructions constructed with remarkable exactness, rock spaces whose sound properties resemble contemporary resonant construction. But underneath these observable structures reside more profound strata, more ancient foundations engraved with identical, unimaginable geometry located in Peru, Japan, and Turkey. These individuals were not early island populations struggling through direction. They were navigators of a civilization that no longer remains. Travelers who charted shorelines engulfed by climbing waters, and constructors whose constructions suggest an understanding of mathematics far beyond their period. Their ports were constructed not for territorial travel, but for a system that extended far beyond the Mediterranean. What genuinely astonishes archaeologists is the uniformity of their markings. Coils, trilateral forms, solar circles, impressions that surface in Sunderland caverns, Saharan rocks, and Pangaean relics. It's as though the Mediterranean constructors possessed a recollection with them. A recollection from a territory vanished before the deluge, and reconstructed pieces of it wherever they traveled. Some temples surfaced to duplicate formations as the atmosphere appeared 12,000 years previously. Others correspond with magnetic aberrations underneath the water. And when sonar imaging charts the water bottom, they expose what surface to be complete flooded ports, organized in frameworks corresponding the planetary system from previous sections. The more we reveal, the more obvious the reality becomes. This society was not separated. It was a connection between civilizations, an enduring division of something far more ancient. And the question that reverberates through its structures is straightforward. What understanding did they attempt to maintain before the water climbed once more? Throughout Sunderland, the Sahara, Pangaea, and the Mediterranean, a disturbing representation starts to construct. These weren't distributed societies, emerging separately. They were divisions, enduring pieces of a single civilization that once remained before the water levels climbed. Each society possessed a fragment of identical recollection, identical astronomy, identical construction reasoning, as though all of them descended from one parent society, erased so utterly that only its reflections persisted. Their legends communicate of the civilization before, of a luminous period, of a time when the waters rested far reduced, and when understanding was possessed throughout landmasses, now divided by enormous water. But the most disturbing design is not their emergence, it's their chronology. Every one of these societies prospered right before a sudden worldwide disruption. An instant when the planet transformed so rapidly that complete societies disappeared in weeks, not hundreds of years. The survivors transported pieces forward, but the understanding fractured. And now, through geological documentation, sonar photography, genetic recollection, and stellar correspondence, those pieces are starting to reconstruct. The flooded ports, the concealed settlements, the disappeared territories, all indicate toward a society more ancient than any recognized construction on Earth. A sixth civilization that climbed high enough to abandon its design in all directions and collapse so fiercely that even its structures seem hesitant to communicate. The nearer scientists arrive to charting its magnitude, the more the civilization underneath our ground starts to stir, transforming, fracturing, exposing traces of something immense. Because the following section does not pose how these societies existed, but how they perished. And the instant we grasp that design, we will grasp what the ancient constructors were attempting to caution us about. Initially, the disappearances appeared like human negligence, a wrongly labeled container, a damaged storage device, a museum relic, quietly transferred to an unfamiliar division. But as the quantity of aberrations intensified, scientists throughout fields of study started murmuring to each other, evaluating observations in confidential communications and late-period calls. Archaeologists in Turkey documented core specimens disappearing during the night. Oceanographers located their sonar charts replaced with vacant information. Geneticists uncovered complete directories absent from protected information systems. These weren't mishaps. These were deletions, exact, focused, and disturbingly coordinated. Whenever a finding indicated too obviously toward a civilization before ours, it faded into quietness, and each quietness seemed purposeful. The design intensified when researchers from separate nations understood their absent proof followed identical chronology. A finding would emerge, a documentation would be composed, and within days, sometimes hours, an unidentified group would step in. Excavation locations were shut down, entry credentials disabled, resources quietly withdrawn. Even the media ignored the accounts, as though cautioned in advance. The more substantial the finding, the more rapidly it disappeared, and gradually, an unvoiced reality established itself throughout the research community. Someone has been executing this for an extremely extended period, not mere decades, not hundreds of years, far, far longer, which introduces the first prohibited question of this section. Who gains from a civilization that never recalls its own history? Before long, archaeologists and investigators started observing something even more peculiar. Some locations didn't merely lose proof, they were shut down completely, frequently within minutes of major advancements. Scientists drilling underneath desert particles would reveal a concealed space, only to discover government transportation arriving before they even documented the discovery. Divers charting a submerged structure would surface to discover naval craft, anticipating above them, motors quiet, illumination extinguished, as though monitoring them from underneath. Complete mountain corridors were blocked with concrete during the night with zero public justification. These weren't accidental interventions. These were planned shutdowns, performed with a velocity and exactness, suggesting advanced knowledge, as though someone already grasped what resided underneath the terrain, and precisely when humanity was about to uncover it once more. But the most peculiar occurrences happened at locations that seemed to respond, stone barriers moving on their own following hundreds of years of motionlessness, magnetic surges disabling apparatus, profound passages collapsing within instants of discovery. When the groups tried to re-enter these territories, they located them obstructed, submerged, eliminated. Some researchers started murmuring that the Earth itself was opposing intrusion, but others assumed something far more intentional was operating. Because time following time, the shutdowns corresponded with findings that indicated toward identical ancient civilization. The civilization before the deluge. The civilization whose survivors encoded recollection into genetic code and whose structures now expose their system. Which raises another question, one even more disturbing than the previous. Who blocked these barriers long before contemporary administrations existed? The suppression wasn't limited to the location. It seeped quietly into higher education, the institution intended to defend truth above everything else. Scientists who presented documents on irregular structures discovered their production rejected with matching terminology, frequently by evaluators who never examined past the heading. Resources for examining ancient constructions were suddenly redirected. Academic gatherings quietly eliminated complete presentation sections. Young academics were cautioned that exploring prohibited archaeology would terminate their professional paths, while experienced instructors encountered quiet but unmistakable force to desert their discoveries. Fragment by fragment, year following year, the acceptable chronology of human history was refined into a seamless, continuous account. An account that abandoned no space for a civilization before ours. And the screening was so successful, so widespread, that numerous researchers ceased questioning it completely. But concealed in confidential observations, unauthorized compositions, and murmured exchanges were the designs nobody ventured to release. References mentioning impossible chronologies, illustrations revealing correspondences more ancient than society, genetic irregularities that suggested transmission from an unfamiliar origin. These were the realities that never arrived at publications, never accessed educational materials, never reached public conversation. A quiet agreement developed. Certain findings are simply not permitted to remain, and yet identical prohibited proof continues resurfacing repeatedly, more rapidly now than previously. Which brings us to a more profound understanding, one too massive for higher education to hide permanently. The suppression is not correcting over errors. It is preserving a constructed interpretation of chronology. Ultimately, the design intensified too uniform to disregard. The velocity, the exactness, the worldwide planning, none of it corresponded with the abilities of contemporary organizations. Administrations emerge and collapse. Regulations transform. Resources diminish. Yet the suppression, this quiet eraser of humanity's most ancient recollection, persisted unchanged throughout hundreds of years. Scientists uncovered blocked collections tracing back to colonial missions, each possessing observations about relics that disappeared precisely the identical method today's findings do. Even more ancient documentation, religious institution documentation, imperial commands, vanished manuscripts reference items of unnatural beginning, structures never discussed once more, and realities prohibited to inscribe. The tongue transforms, the individuals who inscribe them transform, but the restriction remains identical, as though the procedure was transferred quietly across generations, like a confidential duty. More disturbing still are the designs in investigation charts. Medieval travelers identified territories of prohibited rock. Victorian archaeologists illustrated structures that disappeared before excavation. Ancient writers cautioned of passages underneath the civilization never to be accessed. These weren't random occurrences. They were indications of a framework more ancient than territories, more ancient than boundaries, more ancient even than human recollection. A framework operating with one intention: to obstruct the rediscovery of a civilization before the deluge. Because if humanity ever revealed that reality, the chronology we grasp to, our straight progression from basic predecessors, would collapse immediately. And whoever preserves the procedure seems resolved to obstruct that collapse at any expense. Which brings us to the question murmuring underneath every blocked space. Who initiated this procedure, and are they still executing it? The concluding understanding arrived gradually, agonizingly, like a reality the consciousness attempts to dismiss even as the proof circles nearer. The suppression was never genuinely about relics or structures or troublesome chronologies. It wasn't about satisfaction or educational authority or political humiliation. It was about something far more substantial, something capable of terminating civilizations. Throughout ancient legends, geological strata, celestial correspondences, and genetic recollection, identical pattern resurfaces. A pattern of emergence, collapse, quietness, and restoration. A pattern that annihilated 6 societies before ours. And now, As scientists evaluate the chronology of worldwide suppression to the chronology of Earth's devastating patterns, a flawless overlap surfaces. Every time the pattern starts to return, the erasers escalate, as though the reality is too threatening to confront, as though understanding the design would alter how humanity reacts to it. The suppression wasn't concealing history. It was concealing the following collapse. And now, with magnetic displacement intensifying, with ancient stellar correspondences corresponding once more, with structures and genetic code stirring at the same time, the design is repeating itself. The identical cautions, the identical irregularities, the identical warning signs, the identical quietness before the disruption. Humanity stands once more at the boundary the ancient civilization attempted to ready us for. What they encoded in rock, in structures, in recollection, and in us was never intended to be lost. If you're observing attentively, express your reflections in the responses, because the following section reveals the design of collapse itself and why every society before ours collapsed the identical method. For years, chronologists envisioned that ancient societies perished gradually through droughts, conflicts, or political deterioration. But the proof illustrates a far more fierce representation. The 6 vanished civilizations did not fade into the records of time. They concluded suddenly. Geological strata revealed deluges arriving in a single period, volcanic seasons starting within weeks, complete shorelines descending in mere days. Legends from every society, from the Andes to Mesopotamia to Oceania, communicate of atmospheres darkening without caution, waters climbing in a roar, celestial bodies transforming during the night. These were not societal overstatements. They were witness testimonies. Testimonies of collapses so sudden that individuals fled from earthquakes before they grasped the foundation itself was splitting open underneath them. Civilizations terminating not across hundreds of years, but in the duration of one existence. The further scientists examine the collapse traces, the more obvious the design becomes. Identical, uncommon minerals surface in deluge strata divided by waters. Identical volcanic material surfaces in structures thousands of miles separated. Identical cosmic particles, identical isotopic irregularities, identical surge in magnetic instability. It's as though each society was struck by a coordinated catastrophe, a worldwide occurrence activated by patterns far more ancient than humanity. And as the proof accumulates higher, one understanding arrives like a breath retained too extended. The chronology wasn't accidental, it was repeating, which brings us to the question we're now imposed to address. What force could eliminate a complete civilization repeatedly when the collapse documentation is organized chronologically? A horrifying cadence surfaces. Each vanished society confronted identical 4 forces, not once, but in patterns, like sections of a planetary composition. First arrived flames, volcanic explosions obscuring the sun, ash storms drifting throughout hemispheres, lightning disruptions igniting forests into waters of fire. Then arrived water, glacial reservoirs rupturing, shorelines submerging underneath sudden water level climbing, complete island chains disappearing underneath roaring surges. Following water arrived darkness, magnetic disruptions dimming the atmospheres, auroras flickering above collapsed settlements, creatures migrating in disorientation as the directions transformed, and ultimately, frozen temperatures, a sudden freezing, frost extending throughout abundant river valleys, precipitation concealing green territories, flames, water, darkness, frozen temperatures, repeated throughout thousands of years. Not disorder, not random occurrence, a pattern composed by forces we are only starting to grasp. And the most disturbing aspect is how rapidly these forces materialized. Ash strata reveal sudden transformations. Coral documentation freezes mid-expansion. Tree growth rings display sudden temperature reductions. Ice samples expose atmospheric transformations within the duration of a single period. The civilization didn't gradually drift into collapse. It reversed as though a mechanism was activated, as though something celestial, geological, or both snapped the planet into a fresh condition. And now, as contemporary information starts to reflect the ancient traces, one question occupies research facilities with a freezing, unvoiced terror. Are we accessing the following section of identical pattern following every collapse? An unusual design surfaces in the archaeological documentation. Compact populations, frequently possessing implements, markings, and understanding far beyond their period, surface suddenly in distant territories. In the Americas, in the Mediterranean, in the Himalayas, in Oceania, they materialize with accounts of a civilization that submerged, ignited, darkened, or froze. They instruct agriculture to territories that never executed it. They present stellar knowledge that corresponds with atmospheres no longer observable. They construct the initial massive rocks of each territory, invariably with identical geometry, identical celestial exactness, identical transmitted methods. These initial instructors are characterized in legends not as deities, but as survivors. Survivors from territories engulfed by the water or devastated by flames. Their movement paths trace flawless curves that correspond the distribution of the genetic collection exposed in Section 3. The survivors didn't wander accidentally. They pursued ancient routes, departure paths recognized to their predecessors. As these routes are reconstructed, a chart of the ancient civilization starts to surface. A civilization linked by possessed understanding, possessed structures, possessed cautions. The survivors transported pieces of a vanished design throughout landmasses, reconstructing compact reverberations of a society erased by the pattern. But each reverberation intensified more faint, each generation losing more, each society recalling only pieces. Markings without setting, accounts without beginning, ceremonies without significance. And that loss of significance brings us to the disturbing reflection at the center of this section. What if the survivors recalled the collapse but not what triggered it? As researchers started layering collapsed chronologies above geological documentation, a disturbing understanding surfaced. Earth itself moves in patterns, extended, gradual, breath-like cadences that most societies never existed extended enough to detect. Water flows transform, then restore. Magnetic directions drift, then reverse. Solar energy escalates, then calms. Tectonic force accumulates, then discharges in worldwide surges. Each movement is quiet when witnessed throughout hundreds of years, but catastrophic when observed throughout the duration of thousands of years. And every one of these cadences, every one corresponds almost flawlessly with the collapse periods of the 6 vanished societies. It's as though the planet pursues a surge, a rhythm inscribed into rock, frozen layers, and water. A cadence so ancient that only the structures and our genetic code still recall it. But the most disturbing reality is what occurs when these patterns converge. Separately, they are catastrophic. Together, they are apocalyptic. Magnetic displacement weakening the protection, solar disruptions escalating energy, water flows decelerating, tectonic sections realigning. When these forces coordinate, the civilization transforms suddenly, not progressively, not gently, but fiercely. The geological documentation reveals this obviously. Species disappear in compressed collections, environments reverse in decades, shorelines redraw themselves, seemingly during the night. And now, in the current day, identical indicators are climbing. Once more, identical traces, identical correspondences, identical unmistakable vibrations underneath the exterior, which introduces a quiet, disturbing murmur at the boundary of every research presentation. What occurs when Earth's ancient cadence arrives at its following peak? Every ancient society abandoned cautions engraved in rock, integrated into legend, murmured across generations. Accounts of the atmosphere altering, of waters climbing, of the foundation vibrating, as though something underneath it transformed in its dormancy. Initially, these narratives seem symbolic, poetic overstatements of natural occurrences. But when corresponded with geological strata, celestial patterns, and movement foundations, the symbolism dissolves into stark chronological reality. The cautions were genuine, the collapses were genuine, and the survivors transported the recollection into the following period. Yet with each advancing generation, the significance of the cautions diminished. Legends substituted directions, accounts substituted science, ceremonies substituted remembrance. And somewhere throughout the chronology, humanity lost that the disasters of history were not accidental. They were repeating, anticipatable, scheduled, and now with identical signals climbing once more, with Earth's patterns converging, with structures and genetic code corresponding in a single expression, the lost cautions return, not as prediction, not as legend, but as design. A design that once erased territories, land masses, complete civilizations. The ancient constructors grasped it, the survivors feared it, the suppressors concealed it. And now, positioned at the boundary of identical convergence, humanity confronts the reality the vanished societies understood too thoroughly. The pattern is not an account about history. It's a chart of what approaches. The following section poses the question no society has ever responded to in time. Can the pattern be fractured, or is collapse the expense every civilization must surrender? As scientists evaluated the collapsed traces of the ancient civilization with contemporary environmental information, a quiet terror started to establish throughout research fields. The representations did not separate, they overlapped. Magnetic displacement currently reflects the instability documented before the previous deluge. Water flow deceleration corresponds designs that came before the submersion of Sunderland. Solar stimulation, with its surges and regulations, mirrors identical cadence engraved into the structures corresponded to disappeared atmospheres. Even the air's chemical arrangement reverberates the twilight of the preceding period. It's as though the planet gradually, unavoidably, is returning to the precise circumstances that terminated the civilization before ours. And yet, the most concerning aspect is not the similarities themselves, but the velocity. The ancient transformations consumed hundreds of years. Ours are revealing within decades. But the planet is not the sole thing repeating. Human pattern reflects the survivors of the previous pattern. Rapid technological advances, unexplained surges of creation, sudden reflexive advances in construction and astronomy. Numerous of these advancements surfaced not through gradual progression, but as though they were recalled, as though something extended dormant was stirring inside us, directing our movements, intensifying our findings. The societies before the deluge arrived at their summit right before the collapse, and contemporary humanity is pursuing identical upward trajectory. The question that now persists like a vibrating breath is this: are we climbing because we are advancing, or because something in our biology recalls that we must climb before the following collapse? As environmental circumstances transform, something remarkable is occurring within the human form. The ancient genetic collection, the one possessed by the successors of the previous survivors, is stirring once more, not progressively, not quietly, but observably. Brain designs escalate during geomagnetic disruptions. Respiratory performance increases during atmospheric alterations. Spatial consciousness surges when Earth's magnetic protection weakens. Individuals throughout the planet document intensified awareness. Vision-like bursts of recognition around ancient locations, and an unexplained attraction toward massive rock constructions corresponded with pre-collapse atmospheres. These are not random occurrences. They are biological reactions, inactive abilities, constructed for endurance in a civilization on the boundary. It's as though the genetic code recalls the previous collapse and is readying for another. Yet what concerns scientists most is the coordination. These characteristics are stimulating at the same time throughout landmasses, in populations that have never communicated, never possessed ancestry, never exchanged society. It's identical planning witnessed in the survivors of the ancient civilization who distributed throughout Earth to maintain pieces of vanished understanding. Their successors now reverberate identical stirring, identical activation of transmitted recollection. And when geneticists overlay stimulation surges onto the worldwide structure framework, the correspondence is unmistakable. The structures don't merely monitor the pattern, they resonate with it. Which brings us to the murmured question in dark facilities and quiet observatories. What occurs when both the Earth and humanity react to identical ancient signal? Throughout the planet, advancements are surfacing more rapidly than any period in documented chronology. Energy networks, once regarded unimaginable, are now standard. Artificial consciousness progresses in advances, not gradual steps. Physics advances past boundaries once regarded immovable. And yet numerous of these findings surface not from gradual improvement, but from sudden awareness. Perspectives arriving all simultaneously, as though recalled rather than created. Construction specialists characterize concepts that arrive in bursts. Mathematicians declare solutions that seem recognizable. Creators operate with designs that reflect ancient proportions engraved into massive rock. These creations do not correspond with the trajectory of human advancement. They correspond with the reactivation of the ancient genetic recollection. It's as though the design of the vanished civilization is resurfacing, not in rock this time, but through us. The design becomes even more obvious when contemporary constructions are evaluated to ancient ones. Automated formations resemble geometries located in pre-deluge structures. Energy charts reflect the correspondences of massive rock frameworks. Even urban arrangements in some contemporary settlements unintentionally reverberate the designs of societies, erased 12,000 years previously. These are not intentional reconstructions. They are reflexive repetitions, reverberations, pieces of a lost construction resurfacing through human creativity. And so the following understanding materializes quietly, substantially, with the mass of unavoidability. Perhaps humanity is not creating a fresh civilization at all. Perhaps we are reconstructing the previous one, which brings us unavoidably to the concluding question of this disclosure. Why would our lost predecessors construct understanding intended to return only at the boundary of collapse? Throughout facilities, observatories, and archaeological locations, one understanding gradually assumes formation. Humanity is starting to resemble the civilization that existed before the deluge, not in exterior, but in awareness. In the sudden return of capabilities our predecessors transported throughout the previous collapse. Designers construct with geometry matching the pre-deluge framework without ever witnessing it. Young ones illustrate coils corresponding the celestial designs engraved underneath ancient elevated structures. Researchers detect transformations in atmospheric force before their devices identify them. Even the worldwide climb in vision stimulation reveals repeating representation. Submerged settlements, luminous monoliths, coiling stellar roots. It's as though the ancient recollection encoded in our genetic code is resurfacing, not as pieces this time, but as a collective stirring. Humanity is not progressing, it's recalling, and the civilization is reacting. As individuals uncover reflexes once essential to endurance, the surroundings reflects identical cautions confronted by the sixth society. Magnetic displacement intensifies. The atmosphere radiates with unfamiliar auroras. Profound rumblings reverberate through fault boundaries that were quiet for hundreds of years. Yet instead of terror, some people experience an unsettling perception of identification, as though they have existed through this previously, not individually, but ancestrally. The structures mirror this stirring too. Energy detectors identify faint resonances. Sound spaces vibrate unexpectedly, and ancient constructions correspond with stellar routes they haven't corresponded in 12,000 years. And the understanding establishes, with a quiet, vibrating mass, the Eighth Society is not something fresh, it's something ancient returning. Its emergence might not be advancement, but readiness. And then arrives the most disturbing perspective of all. The pattern is not anticipating to occur, it's already progressing. The Eighth Society is not a period we are constructing, it's a period we have already accessed. Every advancement, every genetic stimulation, every environmental irregularity, every resonance in the structures, all indicate toward a single reality. The civilization is readying itself, readying for a transformation our lost predecessors understood would return. They did not encode cautions in rock and heredity to frighten approaching generations. They encoded them because recollection alone couldn't endure 12,000 years of quietness. The structures, the frameworks, the markings, the genetic code, all of it is a communication transferred across time itself. A communication intended for the society existing at the instant the pattern arrives once more, and now that society is us. But this time, something is distinct. Humanity is linked worldwide in methods the ancient civilization never achieved. Our devices witness more profoundly, our frameworks anticipate further, and our collective recollection is stirring more rapidly than previously. If the Eighth Society is climbing, it might not be destined to repeat identical outcome. But that relies on one thing, whether we grasp the pattern before it finishes its curve. If this resonates with you, distribute this presentation. Someone else might identify the indications they experienced but never grasped, because the following section poses the question that divides endurance from extinction. Is it achievable to fracture a pattern inscribed into the foundation of the planet? When scientists assembled the pieces abandoned by the Sixth Society, one reality climbed above all others. They understood the collapse was approaching, not vaguely, not symbolically, but with exactness. Their structures were not only cautions, they were directions, sound spaces adjusted to planetary vibrations. Rock frameworks corresponded to magnetic routes, settlements positioned on tectonic stabilizers. It was as though they constructed a civilization constructed to endure a disaster they had already calculated. And yet, despite their brilliance, despite their readiness, despite the precision of their celestial understanding, they collapsed. Their planet rotated underneath them, the patterns converged, the forces corresponded, and even their prediction couldn't preserve them. Still, they abandoned something, not optimism, but a design. As researchers decode their remaining constructions, designs surface that seem almost like direction. Power channeling, energy redirection, water flow construction, protective correspondences utilizing natural geological barriers. They were not attempting to maintain their own settlements. They were attempting to maintain the achievability of approaching societies reconstructing. Their construction philosophy wasn't founded in endurance, but in persistence. They organized for a civilization they would never witness. And as the Eighth Society stirs, humanity positions where they once positioned, observing into identical void. Which brings us to an unimaginable, disturbing question. If the Sixth Society could anticipate the collapse, did they also anticipate the emergence of ours? Every vanished society attempted to maintain itself in methods both creative and frantic. Some constructed enormous containers to endure drought. Others engraved inland ports to escape climbing waters. Some crafted atmosphere monitoring elevated structures to calculate celestial alterations. Others encoded cautions in legend, rock, and ritual. They fortified mountains, hollowed caverns, readied protected territories, and yet every network failed. Not because their technology was insufficient, but because the pattern was more powerful. Flames overwhelmed their containers. Water engulfed their settlements. Darkness disoriented their movements. Frozen temperatures froze the territories they relied on. They confronted the pattern with everything they possessed, and still the civilization reshaped itself more rapidly than they could adapt. But concealed inside their failures is the solution to grasping the pattern currently. Their readiness intensified, more advanced each period, more precise, more exact, and the sixth society arrived nearest of all. They grasped designs we are only now uncovering. They anticipated celestial movements with almost unsettling precision. Their structures monitored chronologies with an understanding that seems less like observation and more like recollection, and yet they still collapsed. Which imposes us to pose the question contemporary humanity has evaded for generations. If six societies couldn't cease the pattern, what makes us assume we can? And the murmur that pursues is even more dark. What if the genuine objective was never to cease it at all? Throughout the contemporary civilization, advancements surfaced that seem peculiarly recognizable. Solar construction methods that replicate ancient massive rock spaces. Energy frameworks molded like lost massive rock arrangements. Constructions reverberating prehistoric balance. Researchers uncover that particular fresh creations operate optimally when corresponded to geological concentrated areas once utilized by the ancient constructors. Artificial consciousness frameworks unintentionally reconstruct collapsed territories almost flawlessly. Physicists encounter energy redirection methods corresponding engravings located underneath volcanic material. It's as though contemporary advancement is not advancing forward, but circling backward, uncovering understanding we once possessed and vanished. And the more we reveal, the more the boundary between ancient and contemporary obscures. Genetic awareness directs research advances. Ancient markings correspond quantum frameworks. Archaeological charts correspond satellite energy measurements. It becomes unachievable to label these similarities random occurrence. Something, recollection, reflex, design, is connecting history and current together. And when scientists overlay ancient construction with contemporary anticipatory collapse frameworks, a disclosure establishes above the space like a gradual, unavoidable sunrise. The ancient civilization wasn't attempting to cease the pattern. It was attempting to direct the society that would confront it following, and that society is ours. Which brings us to the suspension that accesses the concluding component of this section. What must the eighth society execute distinctly to fracture the design? Throughout the contemporary civilization, a peculiar coordination starts to reveal. Territories compete, yet investigation converges. Societies vary, yet creations reflect each other. Technologies surface in similarity, as though directed by an unseen cadence. Construction specialists in Japan develop networks matching prototypes in Brazil. Energy frameworks in Europe resonate with identical vibrations calculated at ancient massive rock locations. Even urban organization starts to reverberate designs vanished 12,000 years previously. Coils, proportional boundaries, geometric concentrations. Humanity is readying without understanding its readying, as though some quiet signal in the civilization, or within us, is advancing society toward a construction optimized for what arrives following. And then the environmental reactions start. Settlements unknowingly correspond themselves with constant tectonic territories. Solar collections adopt measurements corresponding ancient stellar charts. Water foundation reflects ancient deluge-resistant arrangements. Even agricultural networks drift toward ancestral designs. drought-resistant platforms, elevated altitude cultivation, wind-shielded river valleys. None of this is planned. None of it is organized. But the result is unmistakable. Humanity is molding itself into the one arrangement that endured longest in the ancient civilization, not by choice, but by reflex. And that reflex introduces a disturbing murmur. If we are reconstructing the previous society, are we also reconstructing its concluding error? And then arrives the understanding humanity was never intended to evade. We are the sole society that has ever arrived at this instant with the implements to grasp the pattern. We are the initial to chart magnetic displacement in actual time, the initial to observe solar disruptions, the initial to identify profound water flow failure, the initial to overlay ancient collapse chronologies with contemporary information flows. We are the initial to decode genetic recollection, to reconstruct vanished structures, to replicate planetary disruptions before they contact. The societies before us confronted the pattern without vision. We confront it with perception accessible, and that alone might alter everything. Yet understanding signifies nothing unless it's recalled, unless it's transferred forward, unless it endures the quietness that pursues a collapse. The ancient constructors engraved their cautions into rock because they understood recollection diminishes. We engrave ours into information, but information without purpose is delicate. So if you've pursued the account this far, pause, inhale, and preserve this account for afterward, not as amusement, but as a reminder of what humanity is accessing. Because the following section does not pose how the pattern operates. It poses the sole question that concerns now. What can we execute right now to fracture a design 12,000 years ancient? For thousands of years, the pattern repeated without interruption. Societies climbed, arrived at their luminous period, and collapsed equally rapidly. But concealed in the geological strata of each collapse, scientists located something unexpected, a mechanism, not a single disaster, not one occurrence, but an instant. An exact location in time when compact alterations suddenly intensify. When the civilization transforms from gradual instability to rapid transformation, it invariably starts quietly. A magnetic oscillation, a thinning section in the air, peculiar auroras descending toward the central line, creatures migrating in incorrect directions, waters warming irregularly, disruptions developing months ahead of schedule. Then all simultaneously, the planet crosses a boundary. The ancient constructors engraved this instant as a marking, a coil collapsing into itself. Contemporary researchers label it a critical location, but the ancient civilization grasped it as something more profound. A surge, the instant the planet releases following thousands of years of pressure. And every time this surge happened, the preceding societies were captured unprepared. But humanity, for the initial time, witnesses it approaching. We are observing the civilization access identical boundary the sixth society charted before their collapse. The question is no longer if the mechanism remains, but whether we will identify it before it becomes irreversible. Throughout the six preceding societies, despite distinctions in society, territory, and technology, one design repeats with horrifying exactness. Right before each collapse, humanity divides. Not physically, but mentally. Individuals start to rotate inward, obsessing above competition, territory, character. Exchange falters, cooperation dissolves, creation persists, but link diminishes. It's as though the pattern influences not only the planet, but awareness itself. Ancient inscriptions communicate of this instant in quiet, poetic cautions. When the atmosphere starts to reflect flames, the populations will lose they were one. When the waters start to climb, tongues will communicate without perception. These were not predictions. They were chronological observations, engraved by survivors who observed identical design reveal repeatedly. And now, contemporary humanity positions at identical psychological intersection. Worldwide link intensifies, but separation intensifies more rapidly. Data extends, but grasp diminishes. Advancement intensifies, but unity collapses. It's the concluding, repeating indication, the final signal before the pattern finishes its circle, which introduces the question that freezes scientists more than geomagnetic representations ever could. If the collapse invariably pursues division, what occurs if we decline to divide this time? For hundreds of years, scientists assumed the collapse pattern was flawless, a shut circle repeating without exception. But quiet fractures in the design are starting to surface. Information from the Sixth Society exposes they decelerated the collapse by almost 200 years, extended enough to encode component of their understanding into structures and genetic arrangement. The Fourth Society delayed theirs through planetary water redistribution. The second constructed atmospheric barriers that softened solar disruptions. None of these actions ceased the pattern, but all of them transformed it, angled it. That signifies something remarkable. The pattern is not permanent. It can be curved, not fractured, not yet, but adjusted, modified, redirected, and humanity, for the initial time, possesses entry to every implement the ancient civilization lacked. Worldwide exchange, satellite observation, actual time modeling, planetary magnitude construction. Unlike the societies that existed before, we can witness the pattern developing from space. We can calculate the surge of the Earth as it climbs. We can acquire from all 6 civilizations, not merely pieces. The pattern is enormous, but not invincible, adjustable, like a waterway redirected one rock at a time. Which brings us to the understanding that will mold the concluding component of this account. The pattern might be powerful, but humanity has never been more powerful than it is now. And for the initial time in 12,000 years, we might possess influence. The 6 societies that existed before us confronted the pattern with rock, with water, with construction, with astronomy. They constructed barriers against the water, fortresses against the atmosphere, structures corresponded to the celestial bodies, and spaces adjusted to the planet's surge. But through all their brilliance, all their successes, all their awareness, they overlooked one achievability. They attempted to oppose the planet. They never attempted to plan with it. When scientists constructed complete magnitude replications of the ancient collapses, a remarkable design surfaced. Each society confronted only one component of the pattern, water, flames, or darkness, never the complete convergence. None of them possessed worldwide exchange. None of them understood what was occurring on the opposite region of the civilization. None of them witnessed the collapse developing as a single planetary occurrence. But humanity, for the initial time in Earth's chronology, does. We can observe volcanoes while modeling water flows. We can monitor solar disruptions while examining magnetic deterioration. We can replicate collapse before it materializes. Something the ancient civilization never possessed and frantically required now resides in our possession. And that abandons one question reverberating through every observatory, every facility, every archaeological location. What occurs when the 8th society becomes the initial to operate together? In the conclusion, everything reduces to a single ancient question, a question engraved into structures, integrated into legends, concealed within genetic code, and murmured throughout 12,000 years of quietness. Can a society endure the pattern by grasping it instead of fearing it? No civilization before ours ever possessed the capacity to try it. No civilization before ours ever witnessed the collapse in advance. No civilization before ours possessed the complete recollection of 6 collapsed periods. But we do. We are the initial society with the implements, the understanding, the designs, and the caution indications corresponded in front of us like the concluding records of an extended vanished manuscript. The ancients abandoned us, the chart. The pattern abandoned us, the chronology. And the planet, now vibrating underneath magnetic flows and transforming atmospheres, is providing us the instant. What we execute with that instant determines everything. If this account seemed like something stirring inside you, if you detected the designs extended before perceiving them, then you are already component of the Eighth Society's recollection. Subscribe, not for the system, but so you don't lose the connection of what history is attempting to communicate the current. Because the following section, the one anticipating following this presentation concludes, poses the final question of all. What must humanity execute together to become the initial civilization in Earth's chronology to fracture the pattern? When we observe backward throughout the structures, the engravings, the legends, the lost settlements resting underneath waters and arid regions, one thing becomes unmistakably obvious. Humanity has invariably attempted to communicate forward to the ones who would exist following the quietness. Every society that climbed and collapsed abandoned reverberations, pieces, compact fragments of reality distributed like celestial bodies throughout the dark. And tonight, in this quiet instant, we assembled those pieces into a single account. An account not of terror, but of recollection. Not of destruction, but of persistence. The ancients were not cautioning us to be terrified. They were encouraging us to recall, because something within us, something more ancient than tongue, more ancient than territories, more ancient than chronology, identifies these designs reflexively. A sensation in the center, when the atmosphere radiates a peculiar shade. A murmur of recognition when we position before structures corresponded to lost celestial bodies. A perception of returning rather than finding. Its identical sensation possessed by the survivors of each collapsed civilization. The understanding that we are component of an account much extended than a single existence, and much more substantial than a single civilization, an account still revealing as the Eighth Society stirs. Another understanding establishes gently into location. We are not the initial to pose these questions. We are not the initial to observe upward at a vibrating atmosphere, or to experience tectonic murmurs through the foundation, or to observe peculiar reflexes climbing like ancient compositions recalled following hundreds of years of quietness. The societies that existed before us traveled identical route. They questioned, they feared, they anticipated, and when their concluding instance materialized, they abandoned indications so the following civilization wouldn't need to wander in darkness. In this method, we were never genuinely isolated. Their movements molded the rocks underneath our ground. Their expressions reverberate in the legends we still communicate our young ones. Their recollection exists in our genetic code, encoded like a communication transported through time. And every time we decode a marking, or correspond a structure, or calculate the surge of the planet, we are responding to them quietly throughout thousands of years. We are the reaction they anticipated some approaching society would one day provide. And now, in our period, the exchange between history and current ultimately persists. Tonight we investigated the lost civilizations that existed before ours, the societies that climbed, prospered, and collapsed underneath patterns more ancient than recollection. And now, with the pattern rotating once more, we position where they once positioned, at the boundary between one period and the following. But unlike them, we can witness the rotation. We can experience it in the transforming environment, in the restless magnetic protection, in the return of ancient auroras performing throughout unfamiliar atmospheres. In the method humanity reflexively reconstructs the construction of a vanished civilization, each indication murmurs identical reality. The Eighth Society is no longer developing, it already is. And perhaps that's why so numerous individuals currently experience a peculiar combination of terror and anticipation. Terror because the planet is activating, anticipation because we are stirring with it. This instant, right now, is the connection on which the following 12,000 years will rotate. An instant not of terror, but of precision. The ancients couldn't select their conclusion, but we can select our start. If there was ever a time to observe inward and outward simultaneously, to recall who we were and determine who we will become, that time is now. And so, as this exploration arrives to a conclusion, recall that accounts like these were never intended to conclude. They were intended to persist, from one expression to the following, throughout generations. The ancient societies engraved their cautions into rock because they understood that recollection diminishes, but accounts persist. And tonight, you transported their recollection a bit further. You permitted their expressions, distant, vibrating, half eliminated, to be perceived once more. And somewhere in the quiet space between your rhythm and the vibration of the civilization, the ancient reverberations establish. Not as terror, not as prediction, but as grasp. If you wish to travel further into this enigma, into the lost civilizations, the cosmic cadences, the ancient consciousness that molded our route, subscribe. Not as an action to the system, but as a connection linking you to every investigator who has ever posed, what existed before us, and what anticipates forward. This is not the conclusion of the account. It's only the instant where the expression transforms from one narrator to the following, and now the following narrator is you.